There is a voice in your head that sounds exactly like you. It uses your vocabulary, your memories, your fears. It speaks with your tone and your cadence and your specific kind of worry. And because it sounds like you, because it feels like your own honest assessment of reality, you believe it. You believe it when it tells you that you always do this, that you never get it right, that everyone noticed, that they are judging you, that this is proof of exactly what you always suspected about yourself. You believe it when it catastrophizes a single email into a conversation about your entire worth as a person, when it reads the silence of someone who didn't text back as evidence of your deepest fear about yourself, when it takes one difficult morning and tells you it proves something permanent about your life. Here is what I need you to understand before anything else in this video. That voice is not telling you the truth. It is telling you a story, a very convincing, very detailed, very personally tailored story, drawn from your own history, your own wounds, your own learned patterns of thought, but a story nonetheless. And the distance between that story and reality is something that neuroscience and clinical psychology have spent the last 40 years learning how to measure. What they found is this: the human brain, under stress, under threat, under the weight of past experience, does not think clearly. It thinks fast. It thinks in patterns. It reaches for the interpretation that matches its existing model of the world rather than the one that most accurately reflects what is actually happening. And those patterns, those fast, automatic, systematically inaccurate ways of interpreting reality, have a name. They are called cognitive distortions, and today I am going to show you exactly what they are, how they form in the brain, how to recognize them in your own thinking, and, most importantly, what the research actually shows about how to change them. By the end of this video, you will never think about your own thoughts in quite the same way again. Let us start at the beginning. What is a cognitive distortion actually? The concept was developed and formalized in the 1960s and 70s by psychiatrist Aaron Beck, who is widely considered the father of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Beck was working with patients experiencing depression when he noticed something extraordinary. Their suffering was not caused only by the events in their lives. It was caused, in large part, by the way their minds were interpreting those events. Specifically, Beck noticed that depressed patients consistently interpreted ambiguous information in the most negative possible way. They made conclusions that went far beyond what the evidence supported. They applied rules to themselves that they would never apply to anyone else. And crucially, they believed these interpretations completely, without questioning them, because the interpretations felt true. Beck called these systematic errors in thinking cognitive distortions. His student, Albert Ellis, independently developed a similar framework, calling them irrational beliefs. And over the following decades, their research, and the research of hundreds of others, built one of the most evidence-based psychological frameworks in existence. Here is the key insight that makes this framework so powerful. Cognitive distortions are not a sign of mental illness. They are not evidence of a broken brain. They are a universal feature of human cognition, meaning every single person in this video experiences them. The research suggests that the difference between someone who develops clinical depression or anxiety and someone who does not is not whether they have distorted thoughts. It is the frequency, the intensity, and most importantly, the degree to which they believe them without question. The good news is this: cognitive distortions can be identified. They can be named, they can be examined, and when they are examined, When they are brought into the light and tested against the actual evidence, they very often collapse. That is the entire principle of CBT, and it has 40 years of research behind it. But before we get to the techniques, we need to understand something more fundamental. Why do these distortions form in the first place? Because they do not arise randomly. They have a specific neuroscientific origin. And understanding that origin is what makes changing them genuinely possible. To understand why cognitive distortions exist, you need to understand something about how the brain was built. The human brain is not a single, unified system. It is, in evolutionary terms, several brains layered on top of each other, each one built at a different point in our species' history, each one designed for a different purpose. The oldest and deepest layer, the limbic system, is approximately 200 million years old. It is the brain of survival. Its primary job is threat detection, and its most important structure for our purposes today is the amygdala, two almond-shaped clusters of neurons sitting deep inside your temporal lobe, one on each side of the brain. The amygdala is your threat alarm. It is fast, automatic, and operates largely below the level of conscious awareness. When it detects something, it categorizes as threatening. A raised voice, a critical look, an ambiguous silence, a tone in a text message. It initiates a cascade of physiological responses. Cortisol, adrenaline, increased heart rate, heightened attention, the brain preparing the body for action. This system is extraordinarily effective for its original purpose. If you are in genuine physical danger, the amygdala's speed saves your life. The thinking brain is too slow for a predator. You need to move before you have consciously decided to move. But here is the problem for modern human beings. The amygdala cannot distinguish between a physical threat and a social or psychological threat. A critical comment from your boss activates the same system as a predator in the forest. A difficult conversation activates the same cascade as physical danger. And once the amygdala fires, once the threat alarm is triggered, something specific and important happens to the brain's ability to think accurately. The second piece of the neuroscience is what researchers call the negativity bias. Neuroscientist Rick Hansen described it this way: the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. And this is not a metaphor. It is a measurable neurological reality. Studies show that negative stimuli are processed more thoroughly, stored more strongly, and recalled more easily than positive stimuli of equivalent intensity. The neural encoding of a negative experience takes place faster and lasts longer than the encoding of a positive experience. This is why a single critical comment can stay with you for days, while 10 compliments dissolve within hours. The reason for this asymmetry is evolutionary. In an environment where a mistake could mean death, the cost of ignoring a negative signal was catastrophic. The cost of ignoring a positive signal was merely the loss of an opportunity. So the brain evolved to weight negative information more heavily than positive information, not because it is more accurate, but because historically it was more consequential. In the modern world, this bias produces exactly the kind of thinking we are going to examine today: the all-or-nothing conclusion, the catastrophic prediction, the mind that reads ambiguity as threat, the brain that takes one negative data point and turns it into a universal law. And the third piece is neuroplasticity, which is the good news. The brain is not fixed, neural pathways are not permanent. Every time you think a thought, you strengthen the neural pathway associated with it. Every time you challenge a distorted thought and replace it With a more accurate one, you begin to build a different pathway, one that, over time, becomes the default. This is not motivational language. This is measurable neuroscience. CBT works at the neural level by literally rewiring the brain's habitual thinking patterns. And the research on how long this takes is more encouraging than most people expect. Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, between them, identified what are now considered the core cognitive distortions, the specific named patterns of inaccurate thinking that CBT targets. I'm going to take you through 10 of the most significant ones, and I want to ask you to do something as I go through these. Do not just listen. Check them against your own experience, because I am willing to predict that you will recognize every single one of them. Distortion 1. All or nothing thinking, also called black and white thinking. This is the cognitive distortion that collapses everything into two categories: perfect or failure, always or never, completely successful or completely worthless, with no space for the vast middle ground where most of reality actually lives. You did not complete everything on your list today. Therefore, today was a waste. You made one mistake in an otherwise strong presentation. Therefore, the presentation was a disaster. You were not as patient as you wanted to be with someone you love. Therefore, you are a bad person. The all-or-nothing structure is the brain's threat detection system applied to performance and identity. Nuance requires cognitive bandwidth. The stressed, threat-activated brain does not have bandwidth for nuance. It has bandwidth for fast categorization. And fast categorization produces extreme positions. Distortion 2. Overgeneralization. Overgeneralization takes a single event and extracts a universal law from it. One rejection becomes proof that you are always rejected. One difficult week becomes evidence that your life never works. One thing going wrong becomes data for the conclusion that everything always goes wrong. The telltale linguistic signature of overgeneralization is the word always and never. When you catch yourself using these words about your own life, "I always do this, this never works for me," you are almost certainly overgeneralizing. The brain's pattern recognition system is doing exactly what it was built to do. It found a pattern. The problem is that the pattern was built from a sample size of 1. Distortion 3. Mental filter. The mental filter is the cognitive distortion that selects a single negative detail and focuses on it exclusively, filtering out all positive information until the entire picture is seen through the lens of that one negative piece. You receive feedback on your work. 90% of it is positive. One comment is critical. For the next 3 days, the critical comment is all you can think about. The 90% has effectively ceased to exist. This is the negativity bias made into a sustained thinking pattern. The brain has attached to the negative signal because negative signals historically required action. The positive signals required nothing. So, the negative signal gets all the attention. Distortion 4. Disqualifying the positive. This is closely related to the mental filter, but with an additional move. It does not merely ignore positive information. It actively discredits it. Someone compliments your work. They are just being kind. Something goes well. It was luck. You receive recognition. They do not know the real you. Disqualifying the positive is one of the most psychologically sophisticated distortions because it creates an unfalsifiable negative self-belief. Any evidence that contradicts the negative view is automatically discounted before it can do its work. Distortion 5. Mind reading. Mind reading is the assumption that you know what other people are thinking, and specifically that what they are thinking is negative, critical, or dismissive of you. They did not respond to your message. They are angry with you. They were quiet in the meeting. They think your idea was stupid. They smiled at you in a way that seemed slightly different. Something is wrong. Mind reading is the brain's social threat detection system, running without sufficient data. Human beings are deeply social creatures. Social rejection, evolutionarily, was a genuine threat to survival. So the brain monitors social signals with extraordinary sensitivity. But under stress, it interprets ambiguous signals as threatening ones and then treats those interpretations as facts. Distortion 6. Fortune-telling. Fortune-telling is the cognitive distortion that predicts negative future outcomes with certainty, and then treats those predictions as established facts rather than possibilities. I will fail this. It is not going to work out. They will reject me. This is going to go badly. I know how this ends. The brain is a prediction machine by design. It is constantly modeling possible futures based on past experience. This is an essential cognitive function. But when the brain is operating under the influence of anxiety or depression, the predictions are systematically skewed toward the negative, and the certainty with which they are held bears no relationship to the actual evidence available. Distortion 7. Catastrophizing. Catastrophizing takes fortune-telling one step further, not just predicting a negative outcome, but predicting the worst possible outcome and treating it as the most likely one, and then often catastrophizing the catastrophe. You make a mistake at work. You will be fired. If you are fired, you will never find another job. If you never find another job, you will lose your home. From a single mistake, the brain has constructed a pathway to total collapse and is experiencing the emotional reality of that collapse as if it were happening now. Research by psychologist Paul Salkowski's shows that catastrophic thinking is one of the most consistent features of anxiety disorders, and that the catastrophe almost never arrives in the form the anxious brain predicted. Distortion 8. Emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is perhaps the most insidious distortion of all because it uses the feeling itself as evidence for the belief. I feel stupid. Therefore, I must be stupid. I feel like a failure. Therefore, I am a failure. I feel like no one cares. Therefore, no one cares. I feel that something is wrong. Therefore, something is wrong. The problem with emotional reasoning is that emotions are not evidence about the external world. They are information about your internal state. A feeling of stupidity tells you about your current neurological and psychological condition. It does not tell you about your actual intellectual capacity. The two things are completely different, but emotional reasoning collapses them into one. Distortion 9. Should statements. Should statements are the cognitive distortions that apply rigid, inflexible rules to yourself and others, rules that, when violated, generate guilt, shame, frustration, or resentment. I should be further along by now. I should be able to handle this. I should not feel this way. They should know better. People should not behave like that. Albert Ellis called these rules masturbation, the tyranny of the should and the must. The problem is not having standards. The problem is the specific emotional weight of should. The implication that failing to meet the standard is a fundamental failing rather than a human reality. Distortion 10. Labeling. Labeling is the extreme form of overgeneralization, taking a behavior or an event and using it to define the entire person. Not I made a mistake, but I am a failure. Not I did something unkind, but I am a bad person. Not they behaved badly in that situation, but they are a terrible person. Labels are cognitive shortcuts. They are the brain collapsing complexity into a single category for the sake of processing efficiency. The problem is that human beings are not categories. They are extraordinarily complex, contextual, variable creatures. And any label, positive or negative, applied to a whole person is by definition a distortion of reality. I want to pause the science for a moment and speak directly to you, because I think some of what I have just described landed with a recognition that goes deeper than intellectual interest. Maybe it was the mind reading, the endless interpretation of silences and pauses and unanswered messages, constructing narratives about what other people are thinking with a certainty that the evidence does not remotely support, but that feels completely and absolutely like truth. Maybe it was emotional reasoning, the way a feeling of failure becomes proof of failure, the way waking up anxious on a Tuesday becomes evidence about your entire life trajectory, the way you feel it, and therefore it must be real. Maybe it was the should statements, the voice that compares where you are to where you think you should be by now, by this age, at this stage, given everything, and finds you falling short. The specific exhausting weight of measuring yourself against a standard that moves every time you approach it. Or maybe it was labeling, the way a single bad decision becomes evidence for a verdict about your character, the way you would never describe another person, the way you automatically describe yourself, in the language of permanent deficiency rather than temporary difficulty. If any of those resonated, if you felt even a flicker of recognition, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not uniquely broken. You are not more damaged than other people. You are not someone for whom this is especially bad or especially hopeless. You are someone whose brain learned some specific patterns of interpretation, patterns that were probably adaptive at some point, patterns that made sense in the context in which they formed, in the relationships or experiences that shaped them. Patterns that your brain is still running because no one has shown it that there is another way. That is what we are about to do. The research on CBT is unambiguous. These techniques work, not as philosophy, not as positive thinking, not as motivational language, but as clinically validated interventions with measurable effects on brain structure and function. Here are 5 of the most evidence-based. Technique 1. Thought records. The thought record is the foundational CBT intervention, the tool that Beck developed first and that remains the most extensively researched technique in the field. The process is simple. When a distressing thought arises, you write it down. You identify the emotion it produced and rate its intensity. You identify which cognitive distortion it represents. You examine the actual evidence for and against the thought, and you construct an alternative, more balanced thought. Not a positive one, not a false reassuring one, but an accurate one. The act of writing the thought down is itself significant. Research shows that externalizing a thought, moving it from the internal automatic processing of the brain onto paper where it can be examined, reduces its emotional impact significantly. The thought that felt like absolute truth inside your head frequently looks different when you can see it from the outside. Technique 2. Socratic questioning. Socratic questioning is the internal interrogation technique that CBT therapists use, and that you can learn to use on yourself. When a distorted thought arises, you ask it a series of specific questions. What is the actual evidence for this? What would I say to a close friend who was thinking this? Am I confusing a thought with a fact? Am I using all or nothing language? What is the most realistic outcome? If the worst case happened, could I cope with it? The power of Socratic questioning is that it does not fight the thought directly. It does not tell the thought it is wrong. It simply asks the thought to justify itself. And distorted thoughts, when asked to justify themselves against actual evidence, very often cannot. Technique 3. Behavioral experiments. Cognitive distortions are not just thoughts, they are predictions, and predictions can be tested. The behavioral experiment takes a distorted prediction. They will judge me if I speak up. I will not be able to cope if this goes wrong. People do not actually care about me, and designs a real-world test of it. You do the thing the prediction said would lead to disaster. You observe what actually happens, and you use the actual data to update the thought. Research consistently shows that behavioral experiments are among the most powerful CBT interventions, partly because they provide real evidence, and partly because the act of doing the feared thing itself begins to rewire the amygdala's threat response. Technique 4. Diffusion. Diffusion is a technique from acceptance and commitment therapy, a third-wave development of CBT that targets the relationship between the person and the thought, rather than the content of the thought itself. The principle is this: you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that notices your thoughts. And the moment you can create that small but crucial distance, I am having the thought that I am a failure rather than I am a failure, the thought loses its authority. Simple diffusion techniques include prefacing distorted thoughts with the phrase, "I notice I am having the thought that," or visualizing thoughts as clouds passing through the sky of your awareness, or as words scrolling across a screen. The goal is not to eliminate the thought, but to see it as a thought, rather than a fact. Technique 5. The compassionate observer. Research by psychologist Kristin Neff and others has consistently found that self-compassion, treating yourself with the same care and understanding you would offer a close friend, is not just emotionally beneficial, but cognitively beneficial. When we approach our own distorted thinking with harshness and self-criticism, we activate the threat system, which produces more distorted thinking. When we approach it with compassion and curiosity, we activate the caregiving system, which produces clearer, more accurate thinking. The compassionate observer technique asks you to step back from the distorted thought and imagine a wise, caring friend observing your situation. What would they say? What would they notice that you are not noticing? What context would they provide? What would they say to you that you are not saying to yourself? This is not wishful thinking. It is a technique for accessing the more accurate, more balanced thinking that is available to you when the threat system is not running at full volume. I want to say one more thing before we close. Everything in this video, the distortions, the techniques, the neuroscience, is designed to help you think more accurately. And accurate thinking is profoundly valuable. It reduces suffering. It improves decisions. It changes lives. But I want to be clear about something. The goal is not to eliminate difficult emotions. The goal is not to think your way out of every feeling. The goal is not to apply CBT techniques like a machine and emerge perfectly rational and undisturbed by the texture of being human. Difficulty is part of being alive. Grief is appropriate to loss. Fear is appropriate to threat. Sadness is appropriate to disappointment. The feelings are not the problem. The problem is when the thinking that surrounds those feelings, the stories the brain tells about what the feelings mean, about what they prove, about where they lead, is systematically inaccurate in ways that amplify suffering beyond what the situation actually requires. That is what cognitive distortions do. They take real pain and add a layer of inaccurate interpretation that multiplies it. And you deserve to have that layer removed, not because your feelings do not matter, but because they matter too much to be distorted. Be patient with yourself in this process. The brain does not rewire overnight. Patterns that have been running for years do not dissolve after one thought record. But every time you catch a distortion, name it and examine it every single time. You are doing something real at the neural level. You are choosing a more accurate thought over a familiar, inaccurate one. And that choice, made repeatedly, builds the pathway that eventually becomes the default. That is the science, and that is the hope. Your thoughts are not always the truth. They are the brain's best attempt at interpreting reality under the specific conditions it is operating in. And under stress, under threat, under the weight of past experience, that interpretation is systematically skewed in ways that have been studied, named, and changed by 40 years of clinical research. You are not broken. You are running patterns, and patterns can be changed. If this video gave you something, a name for something you have been experiencing, a tool you did not have before, a shift in how you see your own thinking, please subscribe and hit the bell. Every week on Soul Fuel, I bring you psychology and neuroscience like this, real, research-backed, and designed to change how you understand yourself and the world around you. And I want to hear from you. Which of the 10 distortions landed hardest? Which one did you recognize most immediately in your own thinking? Tell me in the comments, because naming it is the first step to changing it. And your answer might be exactly what someone else needed to read to finally give their own pattern a name.